China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We look at the long-time relationship between the two countries. How does it impact the ongoing DPRK nuclear issue? Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the aftermath of World War II, and in 1949 it established diplomatic relations with China. The following year, Chinese troops came to the aid of the DPRK during the Korean War that saw the United States fighting on the side of the Republic of Korea in the south. A ceasefire agreement was reached in 1953, but a peace treaty was never signed, and the war has never formally ended. Both China and the DPRK share a common border that extends for 1,300 kilometers, and the country of about 25 million people conducts the major part of its trade with China. Both nations also have a long-standing mutual aid and friendship treaty. In recent years, as the DPRK has sought to develop a nuclear program, China has played an important role in facilitating and promoting negotiations, including the so-called six-party talks. But now, as the DPRK continues to conduct nuclear and missile tests that resulted in additional UN sanctions, what role is China playing in helping resolve the current crisis? To discuss all of this, joining me from Beijing now is Tong Zhao. He is a fellow at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. With us here in the studio is Becker. He is an analyst on U.S. DPRK relations. He's visited the DPRK on several occasions. And also joining me from Beijing is Zou Yue. He is an anchor and well known to this channel on China 24 and CGTN. And also with us from Bangkok is Pepe Escobar. He is editor-at-large at the Asia Times. Welcome to all of you to the show. Tong Zhao, can we start with you in Beijing? Because can you give us a brief history, as quickly as possible, obviously it's a long time, China and DPRK relations, especially in light of where we are now in the nuclear and missile crisis? Tong Zhao, thank you.
Well, the China-North Korea relationship was always described as a special relationship, a close ally, a relationship of lips and teeth. But in fact, the relationship have gone through ups and downs. And since the very beginning, since the Korean War in the 1950s, there were major disagreements between the two countries. North Koreans, in many cases, believed that China behaved not in North Korea's best interests. So North Korea, starting from the very beginning, embraced some very deep grievances towards China. And the relationship was never really that close as most people believe. A recent study conducted by a Chinese scholar called Shen Zhihua highlights that fact. And the relationship gets a little worse after the end of the Cold War. China started to normalize relations with South Korea, but North Korea felt it was further isolated. So North Korea always wanted to be independent of China. I think that's a major motivation of the later development of nuclear weapons by North Korea.
So let's pick up on that. No longer lips and teeth, the relationship, but China has been very much instrumental in trying to bring the US and the DPRK together, especially during the period 2003, 2005, the three-party talks, the six-party talks. Talk to us a little bit about that and why China's so keen to restart those as well.
Yes, actually, I was covering on the first six-party talks back in 2003. Back then, I knew it's gonna be a long process, but I didn't expect it will last more than 14 years till now. Why it is so complicated? Because it involves 6 parties. 3 of them are nuclear powers. And they're also number 1, number 2, and number 3 biggest economies in the world. A lot of stakes for each country. So it is very difficult to solve this problem. And most important of all, because North Korea has been feeling less and less secure about its place in the world. That's why it has been trying to develop its nuclear capabilities and ballistic missile capabilities. But China always wants to see a nuclear-free North Korea. But the problem is China's interests and North Korea's interests do not necessarily align with one another. Of course, China has less and less leverage over North Korea since 1992, when it established diplomatic relations with South Korea.
I just want to bring in Brian Becker here, because here in Washington, the sort of viewpoint of the foreign policy elite is China has this economic relationship, this historical relationship with the DPRK, and with this Trump administration, it's very much it's China's role to sort this out. Is that a misconception?
It's a complete misconception and a misreading of history. Not only is North Korea completely independent of China, but let's remember the North Korean government came to power in 1945. That was 4 years before the foundation of the People's Republic of China. We all know that Chinese volunteers came and supported North Korea during the Korean War, but there were a great number of North Koreans who went and helped fight in the Chinese Revolution between 1945 and 1949. So there's been a relationship, what the North Koreans consider to be of mutual respect, even though one country is huge and the other country is small. The North Koreans have a great deal of pride. Then there was the Sino-Soviet conflict, the two socialist giants battling with each other in North Korea, a small country that shared a border with both. It was then that it really promoted the idea of chushe, self-reliance, in other words, going to be completely independent. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, which had a profound impact on the DPRK, I talked to many DPRK officials, they kept saying, you know, that huge government, that socialist government fell without a shot being fired, no resistance. They were made it clear then that they were going to do whatever it took to avoid regime change at a time when the U.S., the great power threatening them, was intent on regime change. And I think because George W. Bush then labeled them as part of the axis of evil in 2002, they said, guess what? We're leaving the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we're going to build nuclear weapons. And that's been the story for the last 15 years.
I'm glad you mentioned Bush, because Donald Trump, the president here, tweeted recently that for the last 25 years they've negotiated with the DPRK and also paid lots of money, held them to ransom. If you look at history, that really isn't the case, is it? In fact, there was a period, Brian, during the six-party talks, but also during the Clinton administration, where it looked like a deal to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula would happen.
Yeah, and I was in North Korea and South Korea at that time. There was a kind of euphoria on both sides of the peninsula because Madeleine Albright went to Pyongyang. She met with Kim Jong-il. She was there in October 2000. In other words, there was a real feeling that there would be a thaw between North and South and the normalization of relations between the U.S. and the DPRK, which is, of course, what the DPRK wants. They thought, okay, now there will be a peace treaty. The war will finally come to an end. And as a consequence, the North Koreans could have trade and diplomatic and normal relations with America, which, of course, is what the DPRK, a small country, actually does want.
I think this is really important. Let's play that George W. Bush soundbite, because it really did have a big effect on DPRK thinking.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
Now, that was George W. Bush on his 2002 State of the Union speech. Pepe Escobar, I want to bring you in here. The axis of evil, we saw an invasion of Iraq. DPRK very nervous, of course, because it's never had security guarantees. You know, we're talking about China and the DPRK here, but for the DPRK, isn't the relationship all about the U.S. and their desire to negotiate with the U.S. directly and sort out these long simmering problems, including security guarantees for the North?
Absolutely. When you go to North Korea and you speak to North Korean officials, they hammer it over you over and over again. We need to end the Korean War. There's still an armistice. As long as there is not a direct peace negotiation between us and the Americans. Of course, you can always have other participants as well. As the RC, Russia-China Strategic Partnership, has been saying and trying to impress on the Americans the necessity of a 5+1 talk. As long as we don't have a 5+1 talk, there will never be a solution. And I would like to introduce a lighter tone in our discussion. Do you know why there is a division between North and South Korea in the first place? Because an American made it in 1945, a few days after the explosion of the bomb in Nagasaki.
Tong Zhao, I want to pick up on that, the American presence in the South, because I've just recently come back from Beijing. That's where you are. And there is a perception in Beijing that the U.S. presence on the Korean Peninsula is basically the problem. And while the Trump administration and others have said, look, China has the most influence over the DPRK, a lot of people in China think actually it's the security situation created, if you like, by U.S. presence there that has led to this current crisis.
Yes, indeed. The perception in China is, look, the United States still has a significant military presence in South Korea with more than 20,000 troops stationed in South Korea. The U.S. is also the most military advanced country in the world. The U.S. has toppled a number of other authoritarian regimes. So, of course, North Korea feels very threatened by the United States. And the U.S. hasn't, reached any peace treaty with North Korea. And there are also different voices within the United States. Some scholars, experts call for regime overthrowing the regime of North Korea all the time. So it's no surprise that the United States is the source of North Korea's threat perception. So from the Chinese perspective, we have to address that threat perception, which is causing North Korea's nuclear ambition.
Brian, isn't that a central point here, is that for a long time, whether stated or not, U.S. policy when it comes to the DPRK has been regime change, or at least regime collapse. In fact, a lot of foreign policy thinking here was it was going to collapse at some point and then the Korean Peninsula would be unified. China, of course, that is not in China's interest to see such instability on its doorstep.
Or to have all of the Korean Peninsula turned into a giant military base on China's border. Because, of course, if North Korea were to go the way of East Germany, in other words, if South Korea were to swallow up North Korea, that's exactly what would happen. The U.S. sees Korea and South Korea as a military base. There's another issue here for China, I think, which is that China sees what's happening in the crisis between the U.S. and North Korea, a crisis that could be averted with negotiations with the double freeze. Somehow, and for some reason, the United States doesn't want to do it. This, of course, comes in the context of the Asia pivot. 2011, President Obama in Australia says the Asia pivot. Well, what is that? That's a pivot on the left, on the military foot, because by 2020, the U.S. will put 60% of its naval and air force assets into the Asia-Pacific region, and thus China can't see the crisis in Korea exempt from or apart from that geostrategic thrust by the United States. That must be perceived by China as a threat, and then the U.S. deploys THAAD and more THAAD batteries in South Korea as a consequence of a crisis that could be solved but isn't being solved. China will say, well, maybe the Pentagon really wants this crisis to keep growing and growing, because, of course, North Korea doesn't really pose a dire threat to America, but it becomes a pretext for the United States to do what it is doing as part of the Asia pivot in Korea
and I suppose these tests and demands from Japan and South Korea for more advanced technology and weaponry does that. Interesting one. I'd like to talk about the double freeze, Wang Yi's idea. But first of all, I want to go to Zou Yue again. The U.S. administration said it's essentially China's problem to sort out. We need China to do it. Let me just read the reaction from China's foreign ministry spokesperson recently. I think we can put it on the screen. China opposes DPRK ballistic missile launches against the United Nations Security Council resolutions, but goes on to say China is neither the focus of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue nor the core to resolving the issue, nor is it the propellant of the current tensions. So that is not the view from Washington or in Western media. Why does China say that in reference to DPRK?
Because this is basically not a China problem. It is the DPRK U.S. problem. What the DPRK wants, only the United States can provide. What the United States wants from North Korea, only Pyongyang can provide. What is that? North Korea wants security guarantee from the United States. That's something only Washington can provide for the North Koreans. And North Korea and the United States want a nuclear-free North Korea. Of course, North Korea can talk about it when only the United States is serious about it. China can only become a facilitator in this, but cannot be a major player in the negotiations.